Office of Economic Opportunity and Community Services. At the state level, he served in the Governor's Office, the Office of Policy and Management, the Office of the Secretary of the Department for Human Resources, served as chair of the Appalachian Advisory Council, appointed by the Governor as a commissioner of the Kentucky Appalachian Commission. At the 9th Annual Kentucky Governor's Housing Conference in 1992, David was presented the Dorothy J. Williams Lifetime Achievement Award for his work with developing quality housing programs in Kentucky. In October of 2014, the UK conferred an honorary degree on him for his life's work, specifically and particularly in eastern Kentucky. During the Civil Rights era, David served our Christian Church Disciples of Christ as director of the Mount Beulah Center in Edwards, Mississippi, doing and coordinating civil rights work in that era. He also has worked for many Appalachian nonprofit organizations and has served on boards and councils this long. And now he's supposedly retired, but if you know David and Betty, they're serving in the summer months as the directors of the hosts of our Disciple House at Chautauqua Institute, which is a tremendous historic center for learning and continuing education, worship, and the arts. It's one of the most unique places. If you've never been to Chautauqua, western New York State, you need to go. Jenny and I were blessed last summer to be at the Disciples House with David and with Betty for a week, and it was just a tremendous experience. So it's my pleasure this morning to invite as our speaker David Lollis. David, welcome.
Thank you, David. I am so impressed with this gathering and ashamed myself for not being here before. Betty and I are out of town a lot. I know that a couple of times I've tried to come before, I was out of town when the once a month event took place. But I'm going to work harder to be a part of this group because I think it's so important, and I really appreciate the kind of ministry that Dave is bringing to Central that includes things like this kind of a gathering. I also have several people in the room who are people that will serve as fact checkers. I have been the kind of person that has never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. But I have people sitting in front of me that you may get a response from, a groan from, so I'm going to be a little more careful today. I love the three questions that David has brought, to kind of focus our attention on these kind of talks with each other at these events. And one, the first is, who is the man who had the most influence in my life? And I really would have to say that it was my father. Many of you knew my father. And Dad, one thing just briefly I would say is that he cherished the good of the South. The neighborliness of the South, the community, the warmth. But he broke with the South on race, violence, and cold-blooded capitalism. And I think that had a great impact on my life as a Southerner. To grow up in a family, both my mother and father, who had great Southern traditions, but also valued the good things about the South, but really took a very active stance against the things that were not the good things about the South. I also just want to mention that another person, it was only supposed to be one, John Shelby Spong, Bishop John Shelby Spong, is somebody that if I have found to be one of the people that has affected my religious and theological understanding in such a positive way. His latest book is The Biblical Literalism, a Gentile Heresy. I love titles like that. And it really is something that has helped me with my own growth in a better understanding of our Bible and helping me to have a keener sense about the context in which much of the Bible was written and how important it is to understand things in the context of the time. Tell about a particular difficult period of my life. Well, and how did my faith sustain me? The period I served as the director of the Mount Beulah Christian Center, our home mission in Mississippi, in Edwards, Mississippi. It's on Old Highway 80 between Jackson and Vicksburg, along that interesting part of the state. I think that my black brothers and sisters in the church in Mississippi were what sustained me during the difficult time at that time in my life in a very special way. And I want to get into that a little bit more detail. But as I look back over my life, I am profoundly grateful to God for Chautauqua. Chautauqua has made such a difference in Betty's and my life since retirement, since 2000. We've been there now 15, 16 years. And I've been there as a guest many times before that. In fact, I think I'm the only second-generation host of any of the denominational houses on the grounds. My father and mother were there in the 70s. And it is a place that I would like sometime for us to have a gathering about those who are interested in talking about Chautauqua, just to talk a little bit about that. Because I think it is something, because of its, it was started as a religious institution with a very impressive industrialist and a bishop from the Methodist Church getting together and realizing after the war, Civil War, we're talking about 140 years ago, that understood that there needs to be a way for continuing education. There needs to be a way for lifelong learning. And we have to figure out a way to create places where that can happen, because many people at that time, of course, just had a high school education or an 8th grade education. And so it was how to get people involved in the continuing education process. And it really did succeed in doing that in a very special way with this program there of education, the arts. We have opera, we have our own opera, our symphony orchestra, both in a youth orchestra, a theater company, and dance company from the Fontainebleau Dance Company out of Charlotte, but and also the concept of recreation. Those are the 4 pillars: religion, education, arts, and recreation. And recreation in the sense that not only do we need to be physically active all of our lives, but the idea of recreation is recreation, where you really do go through a process of kind of recreating yourself on a regular kind of basis and giving thought to that kind of a concept. And I think that it is something that Chautauqua does in a very special way. And I am grateful to God for His giving the kind of leadership, or causing the kind of leadership that has led that place over these 140 years. Okay, now I've answered 4 questions. I guess we can all go to Kingman, right? There's always a but, right? I would like to expand my answer to question number 2 a little bit more. I think that the church's role in the civil rights movement has been always a fascinating subject to me. And this role has been, as you all know, both good and bad, some positive and some negative. We're quite aware of the role that the black church particularly played. And the white church played a role too, sometimes not always very good. But I think we and the disciples should feel proud of the fact that we did have a very important role in the civil rights movement from the beginning in the 19th. It's always difficult to say when did the civil rights movement began, but many people would like to put it to 1960. There were some important events before that, but in 1960, of course, when you had the sit-in in Greensboro, is often looked at as one of the places where the momentum began to build. And At that time, had just been called to be the director of our mission program we had there called the Mount Beulah Christian Center. I think that it's important to know a little bit of that history. We had something called Southern Christian Institute, SCI. And this really was a school that started at the beginning, first grade, and went all the way through 2 years of college. And that was centered right outside of Edwards, Mississippi, on this 1,300 acres of land with the full complements of buildings that you would have in a small college. Dormitory, girls and boys, administration building, dining room, all. But at that time, if you're going to be working in that kind of a place, all the faculty had to live on the grounds. You couldn't, it was not safe always to live off the grounds and do that kind of work. So it is an interesting history that we had with SCI. About 1954, when the Supreme Court decision came through, there was a general feeling in the country that we probably wouldn't need these kind of things. Everything is going to be integrated now. It's interesting to note at that point, though, that there was not a single accredited institution of higher education for blacks in Mississippi. We talked about separate but equal, but there was not a single accredited institution of higher, none. Jackson State, Alcorn, Mississippi Valley, all those places were not accredited. The disciples in the Congregational Church got together and started some conversations about the continuation of what we had at SCI and what they had at Tougaloo. And the decision was made for us to close SCI and merge some of our strength with Tougaloo, and that enabled Tougaloo to become the first accredited institution of higher learning in the state of Mississippi. And it is quite a history, and we were part of that history. But then what do we do with that place called Mount Beulah by the black community? And I was called down there to see if we could create a new program that would be consistent with what was needed at the time. And this was, in the very early 60s, 61. And it was quite a challenge to look at that. We had a huge farm, and a lot of those schools like Berea College, other places, always had farms to kind of support their place. Much as you could be dependent on everything being done internally and weren't dependent on the outside you were seeing. So it was really an interesting kind of time to be a part of looking at what does this farm do. And you had a lot of black farmers that had their own land in places, in little out-of-the-way places, but in no way would the Extension Service serve black people at all in Mississippi. So to sit down and begin to say, how can we help black farmers with various kinds of programs to increase their ability to be successful farmers, was one of the things we began to talk about. And we talked about a program for expectant mothers to help give prenatal care and work toward that whole responsibility, to do some literacy training, to do a variety of things. These things began to come apparent. Well, I was sitting, let me just say one other thing first before I go to where I was sitting. But I just want to tell a little bit about Edwards, Mississippi at that time. The White Citizens Council was, we really didn't have the Klan in Mississippi in that point as we had in the past. There had been a sophistication that moved that into what was being called the White Citizens Council. Same people, but not wearing robes. And it was interesting that a guy named Ray Canada was head of the White Citizens Council in Edwards, Mississippi. And what troubled him, he realized that we were fraternity brothers. Not only were we fraternity brothers, we were KAs. That's a whole other story. But it really, I would sit down with Ray because I was trying to always put what we were planning to do out in Mount Beulah in a context that he would not be worried about what was going on out there. We needed some quietness to do the things we wanted to do. And so I would spend time doing that with him. But there were some fascinating stories at the time that my wife at the time, Jane, some of you know Jane Lollis, who's an attorney in Louisville. She was Harry Davis. Some of you know Harry Davis. Harry Davis's daughter. He was one of the ministers in our church in Hopkinsville and other places. She called it Southern Puritanism and guilt when she would hear these stories. And I think it is interesting how there was a strand of Southern Puritanism in the South at that time that always, because of the way black people were being treated, did lead to guilt. And it would very seldom be expressed, but it was always there under the surface and would manifest itself in some interesting ways. One I liked was the story of Sugar Man. I was aware that there was this guy who had a pack of dogs that walked, big, strong black guy, had a pack of dogs, and when he walked down the streets in Edwards, the white folks would step aside. Never had seen that before. And Sugar Man had a weird kind of respect. And I said to somebody, a woman who worked with us in the African American community, I said, tell me, what is it with Sugar Man? And she said, well, several years ago, the big black river that came through that area overflowed and washed out a bridge on Old Highway 80 between Edwards and going towards Vicksburg. It was raining and cold and dark, and the next 4 cars that came through happened to be white people, went off into the water and drowned. The next day, when people were stirring and worrying and the river was still kind of raging, and what do we do and how do we get them out? Quietly, Sugar Man walks up, very quietly jumps into the raging stream, and one by one brought every single person that was dead at that time, of course, out to dry land. So when Sugar Man walks down the street, people step aside. Another story, just quickly, that I would hear that people say, well, that happened before Jesse Fever hit. Or that was just after Jesse Fever hit. And finally, I asked Thelma again, what was Jesse Fever? And she said, well, years ago, there was a case where a white woman accused of a black man of attacking her. And immediately, the white males came and grabbed this man from his home and his family and took him down to the city square and hung him on a post, a light post. And they castrated him. And they shot rounds of ammunition through him. And he hung there for 3 days. And then, about 2 weeks later, a weird fever hit in Edwards. And people began to get very sick and some die. And it hit almost entirely in the white community. White people would come and kneel before that post and say, Jesse saved my wife. Jesse saved my son. So you could see how that underlying surface tension was always there in weird and strange ways. And this is the environment. I think it helps give you some of the feeling of the environment of that time. And I was sitting in my office thinking about what we should really begin to do to make a witness at Mount Beulah. And 2 cars pulled up. And it turned out it was Edgar Evers, it was Bob Moses, it was Aaron Henry, it was a bunch of other of the black leadership in the state. And they came, and I was sitting at my desk, and they knocked off the door, and they said, David, we have a job for you. And what they described was an effort to really create a voter education movement. Now, we didn't call, voter registration. We didn't call it voter registration. We called it citizenship education. We always had to use euphemisms in the South at this time. And so it was an effort to bring young African Americans out of different parts of the state and bring them to Mount Beulah and quietly begin to teach them how to do voter registration and how to create in their communities some support among the black community, at least, for quietly beginning to do this and to be able to learn the skills of how, when you're attacked, you protect yourself, and all the, both the physical and the mental programs that we had to do to get people ready to go back in their community as missionaries, as activists, to begin to try to see if we couldn't do something about the voter registration problem in Mississippi at that time. And I was excited about this opportunity. I knew the dangers, but I was excited. And Bob Moses and I became, and Medgar Evers and I became very good friends during this period. And during this period, when we had one of these groups here, I was interested in the fact that that black young people and families had some very interesting attitudes about democracy, about community, about things that made me want to kind of get a better feel for what they really thought about some of these issues, but from their life experience. And so I did a little survey form to just ask some questions about this. One of the things that is, when Bob Moses and I were talking one time, we were at a meeting together down in Macomb and in the black community, and a man got up, a black man got up in the back of the room and said, after we were talking about some things, and said, "I don't know what a communist is, but if Bob Moses is a communist, I want to be one too." And that kind of thing really struck me is to get a better sense of that. Well, some way that got leaked to the Clarion Ledger, the biggest newspaper in the state of Mississippi, in Jackson. And they turned that into a form that looked like it was an application to join the Communist Party. And the headline read, "Lollis Recruiting Communists at Mount Beulah." Oh. And very soon that became, of course, a cause célèbre in many kind of ways. And this really disturbed our church in Indianapolis and other places. What are we going to do with this radical we have down there in Mississippi at our home mission? And there was a grand jury investigation, and the attorney from that, then it was called UCMS. How many of you remember the word UCMS? Which was the name we gave, of course, to our disciple headquarters in Indianapolis. And their attorney came down and others to be a part of that grand jury investigation. It was interesting to me when I looked up at the grand jury, all those guys that I would go down at the White Citizens Council at that time to sit at the coffee place and have coffee and tell them about what we were doing was not going to disturb anything at Mount Beulah, now are sitting in the jury box, and I'm under oath. And so it was a fascinating situation to be in. And after about 6 hours, and I got back to my house, Bob Moses was waiting there for me. And I had already heard from the attorney representing UCMS that they wanted me to leave, and I learned then a deal had been struck with the grand jury that if they would get me out of there, that they would kind of let this thing cool off a little bit, and the programs at Mount Beulah would be discontinued for a while. And I was so upset with that, I was saying to Bob, I want to stay. I know that I'm fired, but I want to stay and work. And Bob was such a level-headed person. He said, "David, I'm worried about you." He said, "It's said that if you are put into jail, they're going to put you in a cell with a person who's deranged, and you probably won't get out." and you just had your first child. Our daughter Sarah had just been born. And he said, I think that it is not safe for you to stay at this point. But he said, then there's another thing I want you to understand. The civil rights movement is going into an interesting phase. And we have been so helped by those of you who are white, who come on freedom rides and sit-ins and other things. But when it comes to leadership positions right now, we really need to have this directed by African Americans in leadership positions. So there really isn't a position for you in the same way that you've been serving here. And he said, I've heard you talk so much about your Appalachian heritage. And I've heard you talk so much about at some time wanting to go back to Appalachia where you were born and where you worked with the Council of Southern Mountains and other things like that. He said, David, really think about whether it's time for you to go back now and work among your own people.
Wow. Wow.
I was hurt, but as I digested that in the context of the time, and there are some interesting side issues there that are discussable, but it was something that I thought, Bob, and in fact, that's what I did. And as a lot of you in this room know, I could have centered this host presentation on what I got involved in Appalachia, but I decided because of our connection to the church, to the civil rights movement, I wanted to concentrate on these issues. And let me just say that one of the things that I think really did happen was that we had this incredible difference between the black and the white church disciples in Mississippi. We had about the same number of black and white churches. The white churches were generally bigger, so there may have been more white disciples. We had a regional office in Mississippi. The person who was my closest friend, some of you know Ozark Range.
Yes.
But Ozark Range was the black person who was head for the regional office for the black churches in Mississippi. And Ozark lived on the Mount Beulah grounds. Ozark and LaDan and Jane and I spent a lot of time together helping each other cope with our lives. LaDan Range was the daughter of Roosevelt Smith, who had been the long-term maintenance and caretaker of our grounds at Mount Beulah, back when it was SCI, and had 14 children. And the deal was that each child, as they graduated they got the first one through college, then that was their responsibility to get the next one through. And all 14, the last two were twin girls. And one of those unexpectedly got pregnant in college, and I have never seen such pressure fall on a person. You can have this baby, but you're going to finish college. And that was quite a family. One of the things I love, our head of Homeland Missions was Mary Dale from Texas. And she was a good woman, but like a lot of us at that time, we're just beginning to understand the black point of view in our church. And she was down there and was talking to Roosevelt Smith. And in the course of the conversation, she said, Mr. Smith, what can I call you? It seems so formal to call you Mr. Smith. And she said, well, Mrs. Dale, you can call me Mr. Roosevelt Smith. But the thing is that I think that what was happening was at that time in our church, there was this feeling that reconciliation was what was required. We have to be a reconciling force in the South. We have to find ways to get people reconciled one to the other. And there's no question that is one of our, I think, God-given responsibilities. Yeah. But there are times when knowing and demonstrating which side you're on is more important at that moment than reconciliation. And I believe that. It was a hard thing for Adele Fires and other people in our church who were unhappy with the way I performed in Mount Beulah to agree with. And it's a very arguable subject today. I'm not saying that. But at least my sense was, after being deeply involved with our black churches and deeply involved with the black leadership in Mississippi at that time, it was more important for us at that time to make sure people knew which side we were on, as it was to us at that point. Reconciliation can come, but at that point, to say that we're not going to do anything, we're not going to take anything else, because it might disrupt our capacity to be a reconciling force. And this was one of the key things that really, I think, was a soul-searching part of our church's history at that point. And people like Barton Hunter and others were leaders on one side of that conversation, and Wickheiser and others were on the other side. But it was one of the things that I felt that we can take some pride in standing for, because what became of that meeting that I had with those guys that created the voter, that became the next year, Freedom Summer. That was the year, of course, next year, that we lost James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Swerner. I had left, not being fired, but that next summer was the summer which this experiment we started in Mount Beulah became what is now known as Freedom Summer. And I think that it is so important. There's a documentary, a PBS documentary on Freedom Summer, because, you know, we were in 14, we were celebrating our 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. And, you know, Freedom Summer is what really kind of created the Voting Rights Act and the kind of conversion experience that LBJ had through this process. One of the things, when Swerner's wife came, and he was the only one of the three that were married, and she came and had an audience with LBJ and laid down the law to him about, why are you not trying to find who killed my husband? And that conversation and all the other things that we know the dynamic, but if you watch that PBS documentary, you can really see how the Freedom Summer led to the passage of the the Voting Rights Act. And that led, of course, to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and Fannie Lou Hamer and all of that followed. And I just want us always to know, in this church at Central and in our denomination, we were an integral part of that period of time and of what led to the very incredible summer called Freedom Summer. I'm going to just end by saying that two quick stories. There was a guy named Eb Jenkins from Port Gibson. He was a very distinguished, been successful African American in that area, because his job did not depend on whites. And so he could do some things that others might not want to do. But Ed was in one of our training programs one night, just sitting in when we were training the guys to go back home and do voter registration. And I said, Eb, because I'd heard a little bit about it, I said, Eb, tell us the story of your efforts to become registered to vote. And Eb said, well, for 30 years, I would get up and drive into Port Gibson. And for 30 years, I would walk up the steps to the courthouse. And for 30 years, I would walk in the door to the county clerk. And for 30 years, I would say, I want to register to vote. And for 30 years, without looking at me, she would push the registration paper and test, and with no pencil or anything, just at me, without ever looking at me. I would sit down and fill out that paper, answering all the constitutional questions that were asked on there, and I had perfect, and I've seen it, perfect penmanship, printed penmanship. Very neat. Everything completely answered. And for 30 years, I would take that paper back up to the clerk. And without ever looking at me, she would say, "You failed again, Eb." We just can't appreciate the weight of that kind of life on you as a person and of your dignity. But when the Clarion Ledger hit that day with Lollis recruiting communists, I was actually at the time it hit in New York trying to raise some money. And I called home to Jane, we just had our baby, and I said, "Anything going on?" And she said, "Well, they say they're going to burn the house down tonight, and I wish you were here." But that Sunday, I went to church, as we often did at Vicksburg Christian Church, a white church there. And Otis Swords was the minister at the time. And at the end of the service, I could tell a hush that came over the congregation when Jane and I walked in. And at the end of the service, I kind of raised my hand and I said, "Otis, could I say something to the congregation?" And he said, "Okay." So I got up and I just said, "I know that you all have seen the papers. And I know that you're quite concerned about what's going on in Mount Beulah. And let me just say that we are proud of the work we're doing out there with our black churches that feel that that is their home. And we're happy with our work we're doing on literacy and with the farmers. And what you saw in the paper about recruiting colleges is a complete prefabrication. And please accept that. A hush. I walked out, Jane and I walked out, nobody spoke to us. We left the church and drove home without ever a comment. About 5 or 6 years ago now, how long, maybe a little longer than that, Betty, my wife now, and my mother were at a quadrennial. And they were sitting there at the table eating. And a woman and what was turned out to be her daughter were sitting kind of across from them and saw the name tag Lollis on the name tag. And the woman said to my mother and Betty, there was a Lollis that was involved in Mount Beulah and was a member of the Vicksburg Church back in the 60s. Is there any relationship? And Betty said, well, my husband, and mother said, my son. And she said, well, my mother, the two of us, we were in that congregation that morning after the paper came out. And we have been ashamed of ourselves ever since that day. This is 20 years or more later. And we want you to tell your son how sorry we were we didn't say something in support of what he was doing. I tell that story just to say that all of us need to be given a chance, us white folks particularly, need to be given a chance to speak out, to say what needs to be said, to gain the strength to do that. Right now we're in a period in our church, we're having something that is often referred to as Black Lives Matter. I think it probably will be the next, or is already the next civil rights movement. It will have aspects to it that are troubling to us. But I think it's one of the kind of things that we need to, again, say vocally and with action, and let people know which side we're on. Thank you.
Give a minute.
jurisdiction, we have a few questions too.
Oh, yeah, yeah.